past and the struggles that they were going through. And I thought maybe I could use a vulnerable first-person perspective as a pathway to communicate some of the research on why it is we do this.
And a lot of books have been written about misinformation and disinformation, but you're looking at it from another side, from the demand side, from the people side, about what we do when we're faced with misinformation or disinformation.
I really enjoy thinking about it in terms of demand. I had a wonderful conversation with my editor early on about how there are a lot of folks studying the supply side of misinformation, looking at its content, looking at the map of the landscape, the accounts that share it the most, etc. And I thought that the issue is there wouldn't be so much of it if there weren't a market for it.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. Right? There's a market for it. So there's demand for it. There's an appetite for it. And so I wanted to put the word demand in the title. And she was right and said, people are going to push back against that and they're not going to want to read it because they're going to say, no, I demand to be accurately informed. And she was absolutely right. When I talk about this, people really want to believe that they want accuracy. But I hate to break their spirit, but we actually don't. But our default is not to be empirically accurate.
Well, what I think is so interesting, and maybe this speaks to what you just said, is that we do live in this so-called information age. I mean, we are awash with information, and some of that information is correct and is accurate. So it is interesting that when we do have access to things that might be correct about Anthony Fauci, that we would choose not to believe it.
And if you think about it in terms of survival, to me, I think evolutionary psychology is one of those things where, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? However, I do find it very useful in this context to understand why is it that we would privilege other kinds of motivations over what we call accuracy motivations. Well, if you think thousands of years ago, as our ancestors were trying to survive in a very threatening world, full of hostile coalitions, hostile groups and tribes, what is more likely to help you survive in that context as an individual person? Is it to believe in something that may be empirically accurate, but goes against the beliefs of everyone on your team? Or is it to believe in something that's completely false, but is shared by your team? And because we can't survive alone, and we have to survive in groups, our systems really do prioritize that sort of shared understanding, even if it's wrong.
And teams create other teams who often view each other as, if not opponents, but as enemies.
As enemies, and a lot of times that is the nature of that misinformation and those misperceptions. It's oftentimes about the outgroups. There's a whole area of research on social epistemology, which is the idea that knowledge itself is a social construct and it's socially determined. And my hope was to try to take some of that research, take some of that literature, and explain it through anecdote, example, but also to explain some of the experiments that have been done that are so fascinating in those areas in ways that are really readily understandable for regular folks to say, this helps me understand why I think about the world the way I do, and why my Aunt Sally thinks about the world the way she does.
And I do want to get to all of that, but let me ask you a big existential question.
Already?
Well, yeah, I know. It's only a couple minutes into the interview, but nonetheless, when we're talking about making decisions without full knowledge or certainty, I mean, if there are, how do we live in a world and create a meaningful life when we don't know everything? We don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't have all the information at our fingertips. It's sort of part of this human condition to sort of go on in spite of all of that.
Yeah, and there is an inherent tension between what is ultimately what I would consider a normative good, which is being comfortable in the not knowing and not feeling like you have to rush to judgment, right? But also our needs for survival. which oftentimes require us to make decisions quickly and efficiently without adequate information. And if you think about the pressures on human beings to survive, which is ultimately what we're here for,
Exactly.
You can understand why it would be that when we're in crisis and things are stressful and it feels like there's some existential threat, that we would make a decision to take some kind of action based on information that is maybe not clearly evidenced, but at least makes us feel like I comprehend what's going on. I feel like this offers me some control. And even better, it's shared by other members of my community. And so this is what I'm going to go with.
And what you're saying is that we often make decisions, big decisions, based on feelings.
Often.
I mean, and feelings are transitory. I mean, they're, they come and go.
And that's not necessarily bad. In fact, in my first book, Irony and Outrage, I look at the psychological profiles of social liberals and social conservatives because, folks on the social and cultural left and right, on average, tend to have distinct psychological traits. Liberals tend to be more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and unpredictability, and conservatives tend to need more closure, predictability, certainty, and it's largely because social conservatives are more likely to be monitoring their environments for threats. And if that's what you're doing, then you need to make decisions quickly and efficiently because you don't have the luxury of time, right? So if you think about if we lived in a world where those interpersonal and real physical, tangible threats are present, it maybe isn't so great to have infinite tolerance for ambiguity. Because you do need someone who is going to make reliable, consistent decisions, maybe even off of emotions. Because emotions have been caricatured as kind of, necessarily lesser than more rational decisions. However, our emotional responses are signals that have manifested over thousands of years that signal to the brain what is going on around us. The problem is not our emotions. The problem is that we do not live in a benign information environment. We live in an information environment that is highly manipulated and where we are often exploited.
And I do want to get to that, but just staying with emotions for a little bit, especially if there are threats, and there are threats in the world, one cannot minimize that, then I imagine fear, anxiety, anger. I mean, I'm thinking of all the emotions that one would feel if one feels threatened.
Yeah, and what I am very interested in the research on the distinctions between what happens when we feel fear versus anxiety versus anger. You'd think that they're all negative emotions, and so they all make us feel similar ways, but they don't. And they are all distinct in terms of their effects on our attitudes and especially on our behaviors. Fear is activate that sense of flight, like I need to get away from the threat. Anger is an approach emotion. If something is making you mad and it's not coupled with that fear, there's a target to your emotion. And when you feel angry, there's amazing work that shows that when people feel angry, do you know that they end up feeling more optimistic? Which feels odd, right? But it's because there's a direction to their emotion and they're like, oh, I have something I can do or someone that I need to get because I'm mad.
Is that the kind of fight flight? Then when you fear, you run, anger, you fight.
Exactly. And this, when you start to think about our psychophysiological systems and how they're activated in these different ways and how they can be used to mobilize us, and then you start to deconstruct some of the messaging in our political information environment, and you realize, oh, this isn't just messaging that's designed to make me feel, generically fearful. They want me to be angry because they want me to do something.
And the they, we're almost up on a break here, and the they is anything from advertising to political elites, as you described them, to media organizations.
Correct, and partisan media organizations and social media platforms as well. Of course, their bread and butter is emotional responses of users. So.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's take that short break, and then we'll get back to our guest today on The Connection. Danica Young is a professor at the University of Delaware. I mentioned the fact she's also an improvisational comedian, and she writes books. The brand new book is titled Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. We have much more to talk about after this very short break. In fact, coming up on this very short break, we will talk about the insurrection and the emotions that were driving so many of the participants as part of that insurrection. We'll be right back.
Supporting WHYY, Morristown Friends School, hosting an open house on Saturday, November 4th at 10 a.m. MFS is a preschool to grade 12 Quaker school just 15 minutes from Philadelphia, helping students develop academically, spiritually, and ethically since 1785. Recent graduate stories, as well as honors, academic projects, and internships from the class of 2023 can be found online at the Great Kids Going Places tab at mfriends.org.
On the next Fresh Air, John Le Carré, the late spy novelist known for The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He's the subject of a new documentary by Errol Morris. We'll listen to interviews with him from 1989 and 2017, where he discussed his work as a spy and a spy novelist. Join us.
This afternoon at 3 and again tonight at 7 on WHYY.
You're listening to The Connection here on WHYY in Philadelphia. I'm Marty Moscowane, and again, our guest is Danigal Goldthwait-Young. She's got a new book. I mentioned right before the break, it's called Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. I mentioned the fact, and you write quite a bit about the January 6th insurrection. I think everyone knows what we're talking about here, but this belief of the people who stormed the Capitol, the belief in this big lie that the election was being stolen from them. Many people to this day, almost 3 years after that, still believe in this great big lie. Of course, you've got Donald Trump who, continues to tout this. But how do you see, based on what we're talking about, how do you see the insurrection?
The belief in the big lie is a really, it's horrible for democracy, but it's a wonderful illustration of these dynamics that are at the heart of what I call identity-driven wrongness. If you think about how we're not really motivated to be accurate in our understanding of the world, rather we're motivated to feel like we comprehend it, feel that we have control, and be a part of a community, right? Those 3 C's. The big lie, or the lie that was pushed by Donald Trump and others, that Joe Biden did not actually legitimately win the election, that it was riddled with fraud, there was mail-in voter fraud, there were voting systems like these Dominion voting systems, they falsely allege that it flipped votes, etc. All of these falsehoods actually satisfy all 3 of these needs. So if I'm someone who has been watching partisan media for a year before the election, I've been told a couple things. One, I've been told that if Donald Trump loses, that my entire way of life is under threat, especially socially and culturally. It's under threat.
Because he told you.
Because he told me that that's what would happen. And number 2, he's also told me that the only way that he can lose is if the Democrats cheat. So now, he loses the election. How do I make sense of that? How do I comprehend the incomprehensible? Well, he didn't lose. That's how I comprehend it. How do I control it? Well, there are people that I can blame for this, and there are things that I can do. For example, I could storm the Capitol on January 6th to try to stop the certification of the electoral vote count. And when it comes to community, there's that amazing by one of the insurrectionists who simply says that she's so proud because she stormed the Capitol with effing patriots that day, which to me really signified there was a real sense of solidarity and community among the folks who were there.
So all the op-eds written about the election, that it was not stolen, all the court decisions that said it wasn't stolen, even now that you've got, lawyers who are part of this whole cabal are beginning to peel themselves away from Trump, even that is not enough to change people's minds.
This is what got me interested in this question in the first place, because there's so much research on how if you provide someone with corrective information, a lot of times it does not change their mind. Or maybe they will start to believe the truth on that one little piece of information, but they won't allow that to then update their larger attitude. So maybe you believe a specific little thing now about Donald Trump, but you're not going to change how you view him. That suggests that there are all sorts of other dynamics that are going on, and those dynamics are very emotional and they're very social. They're very social psychological, and they have to do with social identity, which is at the heart of this book.
Yeah, I just scribbled the word identity because that is so powerful for all of us. It's like how we define who we are, who's part of our tribe, what we believe in, how we see the world.
Yeah, and if you think about it, social identity theory has been around since the 1970s, and really it was something that was developed to help account for why it is there's prejudice, why it is there's racism, why it is there's bigotry, and it turns out that it's very easy for us to, and attractive for us to want to be a part of a team for these reasons I talked about earlier related to survival, right? So, but we all have a ton of different social identities, right? Like I'm a kid from New Hampshire, so I share a social identity with folks from New Hampshire. I'm a fan of the Phillies, but when I'm in New Hampshire, guess what? I mean, much to my Philly friends' chagrin,
You're a Red Sox fan?
I'm a Red Sox fan when I'm back home, right? Because, and this is important, social identity is flexible, it's malleable, it's shaped by the things going on around us, right? It's also shaped by perceptions of threat. So, because I'm someone from New England, when the shooting in Lewiston, Maine happened, and now still as the shooter is on the loose and we're not sure what's happening, these folks who I share kinship with, who are New Englanders, who are just stuck in their houses, not sure what's going on, I feel that social identity is under threat. And so I have, for the last couple days, been thinking of myself more in terms of that identity than I usually do.
You feel more like a New Englander.
Like a New Englander, right? And that's very common. We find that a lot. When one social identity is under threat, it's on our minds. And the final thing that makes an identity salient is when we fit really well into a category. So if we look like other people in that category, if we act like they do, if we live our lives like they do, we feel very close to them, and that category defines us. And the problem in American politics right now, Marty, is that over the last 40 years, our two political parties have become increasingly distinct along these really primal lines of race, ethnicity, religion, culture, geography. And so you have folks across the two parties who really live very differently from one another, and so they feel increasingly distinct from one another.
Which kind of cements that tribal identity, and again, viewing the other side as some kind of perceived threat or somebody who's immoral and wrong.
Yeah, the immorality piece is huge. Yeah, because if there is a sense that there is someone who is a member of an outgroup, it's not just that they're different. We tend to perceive them as distant from us and lesser than us.
Let me play a clip, and this is related to that just horrendous shooting up in Maine, and this is Maine Representative Jared Gold, and he was speaking yesterday at a press conference about changing his mind on an assault weapons ban, and this was obviously after the mass shooting in Lewiston that has killed 18 people so far, and many others who have been injured. Let's just hear what he said, and then Dan, I'd like to talk to you about it.
Out of fear of this dangerous world that we live in, and my determination to protect my own daughter and wife in our home and in our community, because of a false confidence that our community was above this, and that we could be in full control, among many other misjudgments, I have opposed efforts to ban deadly weapons of war like the assault rifle used to carry out this crime. The time has now come for me to take responsibility for this failure, which is why I now call on the United States Congress to ban assault rifles like the one used by the sick perpetrator of this mass killing in my hometown of Lewiston, Maine.
And that is a member of Congress saying, I was wrong.
If you think about the language that he uses, it is really remarkable, because he explicitly says that he held these beliefs about assault weapons because he wanted to feel like he had control He wanted
could protect his family.
protect his family, and he, Maine is a state where hunting is very much part of the culture. I mean, there's a lot of wilderness in Maine. There's a lot of deer hunting in Maine. And I think gun ownership also becomes part of the identity in many of these communities. So for him to then say, I've changed my mind on this specific piece of this issue, what that does is that shows a willingness to update one's beliefs in light of new evidence. And at the end of the book, when I talk about pathways forward, I talk about this trait called intellectual humility, which is just being willing to recognize that our own knowledge is fallible and that we might be wrong. And when we live our lives that way, first of all, ironically, we're way more likely to be right?
Well, that's interesting. To admit we're wrong, we're more likely to be right, because we're willing to doubt and question our own beliefs.
Correct. And you're willing to update in light of new evidence. If you are intellectually arrogant and you come at every conversation with the idea that you are correct, you are going to be very unlikely to update your beliefs. And you know what? You're probably going to end up being wrong. I love that this is getting so much media attention. I love the way that he expressed this, and it was tearful and vulnerable, and it expressed a real honest reconsideration of his views. And what I hope is that media outlets and journalists portray this and frame this as something to be respected and as a sign of strength. Because historically, intellectual humility is punished in our media information environment.
In fact, I heard someone yesterday say, well, what took you so long?
Right. And it's like, oh my gosh, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, right? But if you think about when people tend to change their minds, politicians, right? Or if you have an analyst or an expert on a show who says, this is what I think right now, but I might be wrong. The host doesn't want that. Gosh darn it. I mean, you might, Marty. But, I mean, if you're talking about some of these, especially cable news shows, where it's very much about emotional engagement, what they want is confidence, not humility. And I think that's devastating.
And that's Danica Goldthwaite-Young, our guest today on The Connection. She's got a new book we've been talking about with the big title, Wrong, and it's subtitled How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. And she's a professor of communication and politics at the University of Delaware, and she's an improv comedian on top of that. I want to pick up on what you said, too, about the two parties. Although I do think we have a third party. There are a lot of independents or people that don't claim identification with either the Democrats or the Republicans. But this notion that we are divided not just because we look at politics differently, but we watch different TV shows, we eat at different restaurants, we like different food, that the division is really cultural and social and interpersonal.
And devastating. It's really, when you talk to Democratic theorists, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago, How Democracies Die, by Levitsky and Ziblatt, and they look at democracies around the globe and some of the factors that contribute to democratic erosion. And chief among that is when political parties start to map onto religion, religious sects, or racial and ethnic divisions. Because then what happens is that it's no longer a deliberative debate of ideas. It is a battle of group identity. And that can be very devastating. And I'll just say, when the fact that we have sorted ourselves into these two parties along the lines of race and ethnicity and religion, first of all, that happened because of a shift in the parties in the 1960s that resulted from blacks from the South moving north and west, moving to cities, and really causing the Democratic Party to prioritize civil rights in their platform.
And that was Johnson, right?
That was
the
Johnson.
Civil Rights Act.
And there was a partisan racial realignment of the parties. Well, that sort of forced the hand of Southern Republicans ranks, because a lot of the folks who perhaps made some kind of compromises now were leaving the party. And there was an untapped sort of dormant group that had culturally conservative views, but was not a huge political force. And that was evangelical Christians. And so when you look at the deliberate efforts of the Republican Party in the 1970s to politically activate this group, that's the sort of real beginning of this realignment across all these different categories. And while these dynamics are occurring across both parties, right, where we have separated along these lines, I contend that part of the reason we see more misinformation on the right, which we do, part of the reason that
Fox and all.
right, and Fox, but also when you look at the social media research on the amount of information, what it is arguing, the dis and misinformation that tends to favor these more culturally conservative viewpoints, it is an asymmetrical phenomenon out there. And I think in the U.S., part of the reason for that is because under the Republican umbrella, you have a really a homogenous group of identities. They're overwhelmingly, of course, not to a person, okay, but just